In these two sessions, we will be reading together chapter 17 of the book of Exodus, verses 1 to 7. And we'll break this into two parts to keep the sections relatively short. And we're going to focus a little bit more on grammar, syntax, and morphology in this reading, and a little less on literary features. So we'll turn in this first session to the first couple of verses of Exodus chapter 17. So let's turn first to verse 1. Vayis'u kol aduth b'nei Yisrael. It starts off, Vayis'u. This is a call while consecutive imperfect from the root nasa, first nun verb, nasa. And this word really means to travel or to journey. Sometimes you'll see some people want to translate it something like go in stages, but that's sort of redundant. In the ancient world, the only way you could go is in stages by daily marches. I mean, you weren't going to hop on a jet and fly to, halfway around the world in one stage. So you had to travel mostly on foot, one day journey at a time. So I'm not really inclined to emphasize the stages aspect of this. That's simply a natural result of the way that they had to travel in the ancient world. So I'm just going to translate this more generally as travel. They traveled, subject being the whole Edah of the sons of Israel. The whole Edah is a noun that means a congregation or company or a group. It can be a military formation or any kind of gathering or group. Band, not in the musical sense, although the musical sense is simply an adaptation of the idea of a group of people together. So anyway, if you like congregation for that, I don't particularly has the wrong connotation for modern Christian readers in my mind. So I'd probably go with company or even group. But the whole company of the Israelites journeyed. Mamidbar Sinai, Lamas'ehem al Pi Yahweh. They journeyed Mamidbar Sinai, from the wilderness of Sinai. If you remember a general map of the biblical world, at least the southern part of the biblical world, if we zoom in on the Sinai Peninsula, typically the wilderness of Sinai is marked on maps as somewhere down in this southern region, the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. But you should remember that the reason that it's marked that way on the map is because of the tradition that Mount Sinai is there at Jebel Musa, or one of the other peaks in the immediate location. And that tradition that associates Mount Sinai with Jebel Musa really doesn't go back, or at least we can't document it any further back, than about the 4th century A.D. So while it's an ancient tradition, it doesn't have any witness, that goes back to really ancient times, Old Testament times itself. So I think the evidence for Jebel Musa, or a peak in that area, as Mount Sinai is probably stronger than for any of the other dozen or so suggested sites of Mount Sinai. None of them have as much going for it, I think, as Jebel Musa. But no one should claim with absolute certainty to be able to know what the location of Mount Sinai is. There's simply not enough information given in the Bible and what we know from archaeology to enable us to be absolutely certain about the location of Sinai. But at least on the map, this is typically where Jebel Musa is, where the wilderness of Sinai is. And it's helpful to remember here that the word midbar in Hebrew, the word for wilderness, can really refer to any sort of desolate or uninhabited area. It needn't be desert in the technical sense, although a great deal of the unpopulated area of the Middle East is desert. it really refers to an area that's just unsettled, unpopulated, wild, we might describe it today. So, wilderness of Sinai, maybe a little better than desert of Sinai, but either one is certainly acceptable. In any case, they went out from the wilderness of Sinai. Lamas Ehim, here Lamed, kind of a distributive Lamed, they went out by stages or in journeys. And this goes back to the use of the verb nasa at the beginning of the verse. Here, this is from the same verbal root. And again, the question is, how much emphasis do you want to put on the daily stages? And that really, I think, is a mistake here, because the phrase that follows, al pi Yahweh, by the command of Yahweh, by the mouth of Yahweh, literally, the point here is that God determines the stages. So I think what we have envisioned here is not so much day marches as moving from place to place, from destination to destination, and then remaining there, for a day or 2 days or however long God instructs them to stay there. So it's moving from place to place as God commands. That's how I would read this in any case. And so, Vayachenu b'Refidim, they came, Hanan, to encamp. So they encamped at Rephidim. Now, there are 2 things that happen at this place called Rephidim. The first is that the Hebrews are going to put God to the test. And then the second part of chapter 17, the Hebrews are attacked by the Amalekites. As we'll see when we get to the end of this lesson, down to verse 7, that the attack by the Amalekites is really connected to the Hebrews' test of Yahweh. He demands, they demand, or they put him to the test because they ask, is God with us or not? And God demonstrates that he is with them by fulfilling their need for water, which is the subject of our reading. And then in the second part, he demonstrates that he's with them still by defeating their enemies, by protecting them from attack, just as he did when he was in Egypt. So both of these scenes here in chapter 17 are connected together, the attack being part of God's continuing response to the test that the Israelites put him to. Then the last thing that we get here in verse 1 is the statement of the circumstance that leads to the test. Namely, Ein Mayim Walishto Ha'am. Ein is this form we call the particle of existence. It's technically not a verb, although we usually end up translating it like a verb. Here we would probably simply read, there was not mayim, water. Walishtoth, here call infinitive construct, lamed prefix on the front, from the root shata, to drink. Shata is a third hay verb. You may remember from beginning Hebrew that the infinitive constructs of all third hay verbs end in oath. That's in all patterns, not just in the call. And this can sometimes occur with a wow. And it looks very much like the feminine plural participial ending or feminine plural noun ending. But this is standard for the infinitive construct of third hay verbs in every pattern. Here, the wow is not written. We get the lamed prefix. Here, the idea being there was not water in order that they could drink, so it's a purpose, I suppose we would say. They were not able to drink. The people, that is, were not able to drink because there was not water. This infinitive construct is connected to the following word, people. Literally, if we were translating very woodenly, we might translate for the drinking of the people, meaning for drinking by the people. But a probably better way to say this in modern English would simply be to say for the people to drink. There was not water for the people to drink. And that certainly is consistent with the meaning of the text. It communicates what the text is saying. Perfectly legitimate. Going on to verse 2 then. Vayarev ha'am im Moshe. Here, the big question is this word at the beginning, Vayarev. This is a call while consecutive imperfect, third masculine singular, from the root reeve. Reeve means to struggle, to contend. It can mean to argue with in a verbal sense. It can mean to fight with in a little more physical sense. Often in legal context, in certain context, it has the more technical meaning of file a lawsuit. And some commentaries like to emphasize that here, that they're bringing some sort of formal, almost quasi-legal complaint against Moses, the people are, that is. Again, I'm not persuaded that that fits the context very well. Remember, it's Moses who settles these kind of contentious complaints in Israel. So you might ask, what's the point about bringing a lawsuit against the judge who's going to decide the case? But more than that, there's just nothing else in this immediate context that suggests a more legal kind of framework. There's no law being broken here. So I'm inclined to read this in a much more generic sense. The people contended with, argued with, fought against, although probably not in a physical sense, Moses. Here we have, parsing this word, we have two root letters, and only two root letters, so it could be a number of types of weak verbs. But the comets under the performative of this while consecutive form tells us that this either has to be a call or a hiphil of a hollow verb. We can't tell which one just from the comets, but clearly a call or hiphil of a hollow verb. If we look at the medial vowel, the vowel under the first root letter in this case, since there are only two, the Segol tells us that if this is a call, this would have to be a middle yod verb, reeve. If it's a hiphil, it could be either from ruve or rove, if there is a word, as well as reeve. So we can't really get any more than that from analyzing the morphology. We can see that it's a hollow verb and that it's either call or hiphil. But beyond that, it's a matter of looking it up or just knowing the vocabulary. Reeve is by far the more common form here. So in this case, simply a call from the root reeve. So the people contended with, argued with, opposed even, we might translate, Moses. Here the im, to contend with, we have the same idiom in English. This is adversative. They contended against Moses would be another possible translation. We do this in English. We say, I fought with my brother, meaning I fought against him. We were adversaries in the fight. And im functions the same way in Hebrew. So this adversative sense, in this case with, works out in both languages, so it's not really a translational problem, just a matter of understanding it correctly. Going to the next clause. Vayomeru tenu lanu mayim vanishte. They said, tenu is a call imperative, masculine plural, from natan, the first nun verb to give. Here we have a little bit of an interesting textual variant. We have a number of Hebrew manuscripts as well as the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Septuagint, the Syriac, Targum Jonathan, which is an early Aramaic Targum / commentary on the book of Genesis, and also the Vulgate, the Latin, all read the equivalent of tana here. What's the difference? Right? The form we have in front of us is an imperative masculine plural. And if we see the there, we might be inclined to say, the variant is feminine. But that's not really the case. If you remember your basic Hebrew, one thing you might remember is the easy way to tell what the imperative is to take the paradigm of the imperfect, and for the imperatives, you're only interested in the second person forms. So you can take the second person forms, and then if you take off the tau prefix, that gives you the imperatives. So in the singular, the strong verb imperative is katol, and the feminine singular is kitali. The point, however, is this. The ending of the feminine singular is e. If you compare that with what we have in our variant reading, that's an not an e. So this cannot be a feminine singular imperative. It's a masculine singular imperative. And you say, well, wait, there's no on the end of the masculine singular form either. It's katol, so the first known equivalent would be tain. But this is what we call a volative he. Now, the volative he is related to that that goes on the end of the cohortative in Hebrew. The cohortative, the imperatives, the jussives, we call these the volative forms. And the cohortative has this on the end most of the time. Doesn't for third he verbs, for example, but most of the time it does. And imperatives can or cannot have this volative at the end. It's optional. It does not, so far as we can definitively say, have any real impact on the meaning. It's just a variant. If you want to think of it as a longer form, that's fine. If you want to think of it as formed on the analogy with the cohortative, if that helps you, that's fine too. But it's really the parallel kind of construction as that on the end of the cohortative. It's just a variant form of the masculine singular imperative. Wouldn't be on the feminine singular because you already have a vowel there, and you can't add a vowel to a vowel in Hebrew. So only on masculine singular forms, volative he. So the real difference between the variant reading and the Masoretic text reading is that the variant reading is singular, and the Masoretic text reading is plural. In the context, they appear to be talking to Moses, so the previous clause tells us, and so we might expect a singular form. Maybe what's happened here is the verb form in front of this, wayomeru, is plural, and then you have lanu following it, so maybe a copyist somewhere along the way accidentally copied this wow as he was reading by mistake and got a plural. In any case, it's pretty obvious that they're talking to Moses. The only way the plural makes any sense here is if you think that they are speaking to both Moses and God, and there's nothing really in the text itself to suggest that, although maybe it's implied by the fact that they're putting God to the test. In any case, give to us water, wa nishteh. This is a call from the first common plural, from shata, to drink. Notice that this is wow conjunctive, not wow consecutive here. The point is that this is not just the next thing in the sequence of events that's being discussed. By the way, the Segol Hey on the end of the form is standard for imperfect forms of third hey verbs, so there's nothing particular or problematic about that. The nun, the wow, however, going back to that, because this is wow conjunctive, this is not just the next thing in a sequence of events. So here we would say this is unquestionably consequential or resultative. And we'd read it, they said, give to us water so that we can drink. Here the wow indicates the consequence or the result or the intended purpose of their desire for water. So the fact that this is not wow consecutive clarifies that reading for us. Vayomer lahem Moshe, and they said, Moses said to them, now we get the response of Moses, Ma tirivun imadi. Here, ma is an interrogative pronoun, usually translated what, although in some contexts, if you look this up in the lexicon will tell you that it is not always what, although that's the most common. Also sometimes why or how. And here, why seems to be the best contextual reading. Why do you contend or argue imadi with me or perhaps against me? Ma tanasun eth Yahweh. And why do you tanasun? Here, piel, from the root nasa, to test or try. The fact that it's piel is evident from the schwa under the preformative, the pathak under the first root letter, the doubled middle root letter in this case. It is third hey, and the third hey has fallen off before the wow of the ending, which is normal for third hey verbs. And we have what we call a paragogic nun on the end, which serves to make the form longer, but doesn't, again, substantially modify the meaning. Before we leave this word, it's probably worth saying a little bit about how we understand the meaning of it. Often you'll hear or read treatments of this that bring up the question of God putting people in the way of temptation. And the question is, do the people believe that God is trying to lead them into sin? And so often speakers or preachers will go to lead us not into temptation in the Lord's Prayer. And that too can be easily misunderstood, because this word nasa in Hebrew does not regularly at least mean to tempt in the sense of trying to get someone to sin. Satan tempts us. He tries to get us to rebel against God, to trick us into sinning or to lead us into disobedience, as he did with Eve. God does not do that, and that's not what nasa means most of the time. Most of the time, it means to test or to try. And the point is this, it's not that God doesn't know. Again, that's not the issue. God's knowledge is not really the issue here. This is more like Lutherans would think of second use of the law, the second function of the law. God puts his people in situations where they will either be faithful and follow, or they will turn away and be disobedient, so that we can see by our response the need of God's grace. So here, God is putting them to the test so that they can see who they are, so that the world can see who that they are, so that they can demonstrate publicly on the stage of history, if you will, that God's judgment of them is legitimate and fair, and not unfair. So this is part of the theme that starts at the end of chapter 15 already in the book of Exodus, where God puts Israel to the test. and he does it again in chapter 16. And now here in chapter 17, the tables are being turned. Israel is putting God to the test. And here it becomes obvious that nasa doesn't mean to necessarily to lead into temptation to sin, because Israel is not going to lead God into sin, to tempt him in that way. No, they are putting God to the test because they don't really believe. In this case, they're putting God to the test is an expression of their unbelief, their lack of trust in the God who redeemed them from Egypt, but also it's a bit of what we would call spiritual arrogance, thinking that they have the right to judge God. And so there's a spiritual issue there as well. But this has nothing to do with leading into temptation in the sense of sinning. So they ask, why does Moses asked, why do you put Yahweh to the test? So that brings us to the end of the first part of our reading of Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. We'll continue with verse 3 in the next part.